Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bret Baier.
Good evening, everyone. My name's John Heubusch, and I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who protect us and defend our freedom around the world, if you'd please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks very much. Please be seated. Well, as we get started this evening, I'd like to make sure that I recognize a couple of special guests that we have with us this evening, and we'll start with the man that represented this congressional district for 26 years, Congressman Elton Gallegly and his wife Janice. Elton. And we will not do this event if I don't recognize Katie Ricaldi-Buckley. Katie, who is Bret's assistant. Katie. Thanks for coming, Katie. As some of you may know, in just a couple of months, I'll be leaving my position as the executive director of the Reagan Foundation and Institute. So I hope you will forgive me if I take this opportunity to wax a little nostalgic over some of the previous visits our guest tonight has paid to the Reagan Library in the years I've been here. I have had the opportunity to interview quite a few people on this stage, but you can just imagine the nervousness quotient involved when I have the job of interviewing, well, a professional interviewer, someone who does it for a living. For those of you who routinely watch Bret Baier conducting interviews each evening on Fox News, as I do, you know exactly what I mean. He is among the very best in the business. And you need not take my word for it. Viewers consistently rank Bret's newscast as the top-rated cable news program in his time slot, and that has been the case for many years. But Bret has a second career going as a best-selling author. And we are not talking about the "Am I cool or what?" autobiography, or a cookbook, or a self-help guide that reveals his formula for how you too can be a network anchor. Rather, with the publication of this, his fifth nonfiction work, it's official. Bret Baier is a talented presidential historian and writer with a knack for shining a light on pivotal leaders at pivotal moments in American history that always seem to be worth another look. His 3-day series gave us a very important glimpse into the lives of 3 U.S. presidents, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, and FDR, all who changed the course of history and the fate of the nation. His newest book, on our 18th president, Ulysses S. Grant, entitled To Rescue the Republic, is as educational as it is timely. And I say educational in that Grant was far more important in U.S. history than some historians have given him credit for. And timely in that when it comes to the fragility of our national unity, as in the times we live in today, well, a read of Bret's book shows you that we have been here before. It is always a pleasure and an honor to have him with us. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please join me in welcoming to the Reagan Library, Mr. Bret Baier.
Thanks so much, John. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It is great to be back here. Thank you for making the effort to come out, mask and all. And we had our show out here today, which we love to do ahead of these events, and started it with Reagan sound bites. You know, looking at the big issues that Reagan dealt with that are big issues that we're dealing with today. So it kind of all works out. And I want to say hi to my friends, the O'Hurleys, John and Lisa. And I know I have other friends in the audience, but let's talk Grant.
You got it. Before we talk about Grant, Bret, your very first visit here, I don't know, 8, 9 years ago, was about your first book and the real challenges that you had with your son, Paul. A remarkable book. Just please tell us he's okay.
Yeah. He's doing great. Thank you. That first book was called Special Heart, Journey of Hope, Love, Hope, Courage. Oh my gosh, Katie, what is it? Faith, Hope, Courage, and Love. I'm thinking Grant. I'm thinking... Anyway, bottom line, Paul is doing fantastic. He has had 4 open heart surgeries, 10 angioplasties. His last one was in December, his open heart surgery. And Paul is now an inch taller than me. He is 6 feet tall, wears a size 13 shoe.
Wow.
And he's a golfer, a basketball player, and he's doing fantastic. So thank you.
Bret, it seems in your books, your choices of presidents to study, that you look oftentimes for an inflection point, a moment in time when that particular president uniquely changed the course of history. Is that how you go after your subjects?
You know, when we started this, and you interviewed me all along in the 3-day series of those books, and the first one was Eisenhower, and it took a long time to find that, but I realized that I didn't know about President Eisenhower. I knew about General Eisenhower. And so it was a discovery for me. And I talked about that process of having this team and a researcher who goes into the National Archives that are literally treasure troves of nuggets, of historical nuggets. And that book, focusing on the 3 days in between Eisenhower and Kennedy's inauguration, kind of opened my eyes to moments in history that are either overlooked or not focused on enough. And so then the second book is about Reagan and the final summits with Gorbachev and a speech he gives at Moscow State University, which in the big span of history is an amazing speech if you think about it, and just wasn't focused on a lot at the time. And then 3 days at the brink is FDR, Churchill, and Stalin planning D-Day at the Tehran conference, which gets overshadowed by Yalta. So it's kind of like another spotlight that I wanted to give to something that I didn't think was focused on. So once that 3-day series was done and the beginning, middle, and end of the Cold War, I wanted to find something that was also overlooked. And I looked at Grant and I thought, I know nothing about his presidency other than he was a drunk and it was scandal-filled and he basically handed the baton off. I didn't really know. And I'm a student of history. So we started digging in. And, you know, Grant people will focus on his time as general, which was really spectacular. And there's amazing stories in the book that kind of go through his time. It's not Ron Chernow, which is 800 pages, which I am a big fan of, but then spends a lot of time on his presidency, which was really consequential. If you think about all that happened in his time, he takes over for Andrew Johnson, which is by far, I think, one of our worst presidents, and if not the worst. Racist. He was, I mean, I won't sugarcoat it. There's not a lot of fair and balanced in my description of Johnson, but Lincoln is assassinated, and Johnson is erasing Lincoln's vision day by day, and Grant can see that happening before him. And he eventually is drafted to run for president, wins in a landslide. And what he gets done is he pushes through the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. He fights the KKK with federal troops. He tries to keep the country together and win the peace after the war. And that really thrilled me, to be able to dig in and kind of tell that story. And the climax is as he's leaving the contested election of 1876.
Yeah, I get the sense from the outset you feel like Grant was one of the most underappreciated presidents.
So his ranking in those historian rankings has gone up 13 spots in recent years. That's before my book. So Eisenhower went up 5 spots. We have looked back and why the historians choose to look at it again. I think in this day and age, when we're in such a partisan divide, and everything that we talk about with race, looking back at all that he did to hold the country together at a really pivotal time gives him another look.
Yeah, I wonder, do you think that, he to this day is known as one of the most, if not the most brilliant of American generals. Is it his reputation as a general just overshadowed his presidency?
Yes, in part because he wrote his memoirs about his time in really eloquent terms. At the end of his life, he leaves the presidency. We're kind of going chronologically in a different spot, but after he leaves the presidency, he's trusted a lot of people in his time in office, and they've burned him a couple times, and that's where some of the corruption comes from. And after he leaves the presidency, he trusts somebody else, a part of his family, who he invests with, makes some money, but then invests more and loses everything. He is poor after the presidency and has to start writing articles for a magazine about his time in the Civil War. And Mark Twain is his friend, and he says, "How much are you getting paid for these articles?" And he says, $500. And Twain really is upset by this. And he says, "You are much better than that. You're a president. You're the biggest general we've ever had. You need to start writing your memoir, and I will publish it." And it was so good, so well written, a lot of people thought Twain wrote it, but he didn't. He said he only edited a few pages. He starts writing his memoir, and this is the Civil War part, and he gets throat cancer to the point where he can barely swallow, and they're spraying cocaine mist in the back of his throat so he can swallow and live. He's huddled in blankets and writing longhand because he wants to finish so that he could provide money for his wife, Julia. And he finishes his memoir, and a few days later he dies. Twain sells it. It's the most best-selling book of the time. He makes roughly $300,000, which equates to about $14 million in today's terms, and thereby takes care of his family.
Amazing. Again, when you think of Grant and as a general, at least I always thought of him as this big, imposing figure of a man. But actually, he was small in stature, wasn't he?
He was really slight. He was, 5'7", 5'8". He was 130 pounds wet. Why do they add the wet part? 130 pounds wet. I don't know. I was on Gutfeld's show, and I said he was 5'7", 5'8", and no offense. And he didn't like that too much. But anyway, he was really small. So he, as a soldier, he never really wanted to be a soldier. His dad forced him to go to West Point. And he was not that great at much. He went to West Point kicking and screaming, and when he went there, he got the appointment, and they said, well, you have the appointment, Ulysses S. Grant. And he said, no, my name is Hiram Ulysses Grant. And they said, well, you can only get this appointment if your name is Ulysses S. Grant. And so his name became Ulysses S. Grant. S stands for nothing. His name was really Hiram. And then he changed his name. He kind of stunk in school. He was 20 out of 39. He got a lot of demerits, but he was a really good horseman. And it turned out that he was an excellent soldier. And he showed that in the Mexican-American War. Had some tough times, though. He went out to the Northwest Territory. He was really lonely and started drinking, as some lonely soldiers might do. And he was slight, again, and could not hold his liquor that well. And he got busted by a commander, drunk. And he said, either you resign your post or we're going to court-martial you. And so he resigned. He went back to Galena, Illinois, and went into this spiral where he was bad at farming and bad in the leather business. And he was finally selling firewood out of the back of a cart to make money. And 3 years after that, he is the head of Union forces as the biggest general America has ever seen. And a few years after that, he's president of the United States.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. Now, he graduates from West Point, and I thought this is a really interesting bit of trivia. He was, in the Mexican-American War, he fought alongside who?
He fought alongside a bunch of guys, Zachary Taylor.
Robert E. Lee.
Robert E. Lee, a number of the Confederate generals that he ends up fighting against. That's where there's interesting intersections between all of these guys in these battles, because they have fought with each other before. And so they have these established relationships. You know, I'll jump forward again. At Grant's funeral, just to show you how well respected he was across the land, 1 million people show up in New York City and line the streets. And they bring out their old uniforms, Union uniforms and Confederate uniforms, and they line the streets of New York City. And his pallbearers are 2 Union generals and 2 Confederate generals at the end of his life. And that's the relationships they had that went back all the way to the Mexican-American War.
Yeah, now, in your book, you cover the fact that Lincoln, he wasn't envious, but he looked over his shoulder at some points and saw Grant and thought, oh my gosh, this guy might run for president against me, right?
Yeah, he did. However, Grant, you know, he thought that he was that popular, and he was that popular with the American people, but Grant never had that aspiration. He really didn't want to run for political office. He was asked all the time to run for president, and he said, the only office I ever thought about running for was mayor of Galena, so I could build a sidewalk from my house to the depot. And so he finishes as the Union general on the end of the war, and he goes back to Galena, Illinois, and they held a parade for him, and there's a big sign that says, General, the sidewalk is done. That was his only political aspiration. But he does get recruited to run, and obviously he has this admiration for Lincoln, a relationship that Lincoln truly believes that even he's an internal kind of soft-spoken guy, he sees this leadership in Grant. Another nugget is that Lincoln, Mrs. Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln, the president, invite the Grants to Ford Theater the night of the assassination. And the Grants almost go, but Mary Todd Lincoln, Julia Grant was not a big fan of Mary Todd Lincoln, and Mrs. Grant says they've got to go see their children in New Jersey, which they did, and President Lincoln is assassinated that night. Grant is bereft with guilt, and he thinks, if I had been there, I would have been able to save President Lincoln. He was also a target, Grant was, of John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah, and after Lincoln's assassinated, Grant stands as, at the time, as the most popular figure, right?
By far.
Yeah.
And Johnson despised that. He despised that Grant had that power and grew to really, really hate him. Johnson did.
Yeah.
To the point where he was just trying to figure out how to get him out of the way. He wanted to send him to Mexico. He wanted to do these other things. And Grant stood up to him and said no. And, he said, if it's a military order, I will go. But I'm not going if this is just you sending me.
Yeah. I found it Grant, of course, known as the brilliant the Union general. But you write in your book that because of the approach that he took to Southern soldiers, to the Confederates, I don't want to say people of the South admired him as much as those in the North, but there really was a respect for Grant, wasn't there?
Very much so. I mean, he was obviously seen as a victor in the North and victorious, but in the South he was seen as magnanimous because in victory he gave dignity to those soldiers. He let them leave with their gun and their horse. He offered personal support for the generals who he knew from fighting with before, and offered to help them out as far as getting back on their feet. So he was considered, even in the South, as somebody that was well respected, to the point of his presidential library is at Mississippi State University, which is near Vicksburg.
Yeah. You call him, I think at some point, he's like the anti-politician. This was a really neat fact I didn't know, but reveal who Grant voted for president when Grant ran for president.
He did not vote for himself. He wrote in names, and he was not a self-promoter at all, in the least. And he was this guy that was so self-deprecating, so self-effacing that before he's running for president, by the way, it comes from his mom, Hannah, who despised pomp and circumstance and formality to the point where she was seen sweeping her front porch when he was being inaugurated. She did not go to the inauguration. She hated all the pomp of all of that. And she actually, crossing books here, it reminds me a lot of Eisenhower's mom, who was the exact same way and didn't really care that he was the winning general of World War II. So maybe there's something in the mom that is not that into it. But a quick story was, as he's getting his 4th star, Lincoln calls him up to Washington, and he brings his son Fred. And Grant does not dress well. He's got a rumply uniform. He's got muddy boots. And he walks into the Willard Hotel where Lincoln has put him up. That's a really fancy hotel in Washington next to the White House. And he walks in, and the clerk looks at him and says, "Oh, we do not have a room for you. We don't have any more rooms." And he said, "Okay." And he said, "Well, we might have this little closet on the top floor." And Grant looks at his son and says, "That'll be fine. That'll be fine." And signs the register, U.S. Grant and son Fred, Galena, Illinois. And the clerk looks at it and turns white and goes and runs and gets the manager, and they are quickly escorted to the bridal suite at the Willard Hotel. So he's just kind of a self-effacing guy who's not that into the moment. But in the moment, he is somebody who kind of exudes this quiet leadership. And I think that was the case as president.
Yeah, I think you described him as a very, very complex personality, hard to get to know him, didn't have close friends.
Not a lot of close friends, a couple of close friends. Sherman was a close friend as a military aide. A man named Childs, who is a Philadelphia businessman who he gets to know and shares time at a vacation home. Another quick anecdote of his self-effacing self. He's going to this vacation home in Long Branch, New Jersey, and he gets on a steamer, a boat, and he's by himself. And a woman comes with her 2 children, and she is trying to take them to the other side and put them on the boat, but she can't stay. She has to go off, and she's looking around frantically for someone to stay with the children, and somebody will pick them up on the other side. And he walks up to them and says, "Ma'am, I'd be happy to escort your children to the other side." And she looks at him, and he's like, again, this scrabbly kind of man. And she kind of looks at him, and he says, "Ma'am, I'm General Grant." And she looks at him and says, "Oh, well, indeed you are." And there's the kids, and they made it to the other side. But I think what I took away the most was that he was very complex. He had this amazing relationship with his wife, Julia. For all the people who said that he was this big drunk throughout his life, he didn't drink at all when Julia was with him, and Julia was with him a lot. So the evidence of him being a drunkard in the White House is it's not there from everything we looked at. And I think that there are so many consequential moments during his presidency, not the least of which is the end, which is the 1876 election. That is in doubt. The country is divided. Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican, Samuel Tilden is the Democrat, and 3 states put up 2 sets of electors, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. And so those states are saying, we are not deciding. We're going to say that both of them won. So over a couple of weeks, the violence starts to bubble up in the country, and they're threatening violence on Capitol Hill. And it's at that moment that Grant starts to work behind the scenes for this grand bargain, which really keeps the country together.
Yeah, I want to cover that in a minute. In the meantime, though, that when he enters office, it seems you described there's some things about Grant that you'd say, I really admire that. He was the anti-politician. He just meant business, But at the same time, I think you write that because he had zero political experience and was not interested in getting any, that's inevitably what led to so many of the scandals that took place during his presidency, right?
Yeah. He trusted a lot of people, and he did not have a political insider's savvy about the possibility of corruption. So he puts some of his friends in positions of power, and some of them take advantage of him. And there are some decent-sized scandals in his administration, but nothing that ties to him, other than his inability to choose the right person, or rather choose the wrong person to trust.
Yeah. Talk about the 14th Amendment and the dilemma, essentially, in that Grant needed to and wanted to enforce it, but this was not something easy to do. Right?
Not something easy to do. The citizenship for blacks and then eventually voting, it is being fought in the southern states, and there is a palpable sense that if you can't enforce it, what good is it? So that's the argument as he's pushing this. The Supreme Court is a force that is kind of undercutting the 14th and 15th Amendments as well. And he's really battling to carry the torch from Lincoln's vision to bring the country together on race and to get past the Civil War.
Yeah, and so in the South, it's these like 2 opposing equal forces, and one is the South wanting to return to its ways and Grant wanting to push it along, but then there's the South wanting to return to its ways with respect to slavery and the lack of respect for blacks, right? That had to be the most difficult issue to deal with.
100%. And Johnson, because of some of the things he did to empower the vestiges of the Confederacy, he kind of gave them the signal, like the hat tip. This is it, guys. This is the time. And so when Grant takes over, he's got to unwind what Johnson has done and remind people of the vision of Lincoln before him. And it's a fascinating time. I think you think of presidents in tough positions, and that's a big tough one. When he's making this grand bargain with the election in doubt, and really we're a country on the brink of falling back into a civil war. We say it's the KKK, but in reality it's a white militia that is former Confederate soldiers that believe this is the time to rise up again. So it's an insurgency that's happening. And he's trying to make this deal in a way that they will buy in. Because if all parties are not bought in, the deal is going to fall apart.
Yeah, and then you get a sense for just how difficult this must have been. And I must have missed this day in history class because I didn't realize this until I read your book, Bret. But talk about the Dominican Republic and the role that Grant and others thought it might play in this whole mess.
I mean, they were trying to think of everything. They were throwing everything against the wall about possibilities to soothe the South or make it so that this wasn't an issue. So one of the things they think about, which is just out there, if you think about big picture, is taking the Dominican Republic and have all former slaves just move there, just everybody. And suddenly, people are thinking, well, maybe this could work. Maybe this could solve the South's problems. And it was unfeasible from the beginning, and it goes down in flames as a suggestion, but it just goes to show you that they were kind of trying to think of everything to throw up against the wall.
Yeah. Then, meanwhile, there's the great westward expansion of the United States, which creates a whole nother set of intractable issues for Grant to have to deal with because of
Native Americans and the battles that Native Americans have. He is the first president to really do outreach to Native Americans. He installs a Native American as Interior Secretary, and he is really trying to make this effort. But because of the constant battle and violence out in the West, he loses to circumstances. But it's not without trying that he continues to try to make inroads with Native Americans and try to make a peace. And, if you look at the moments that the efforts to make outreach and then the reality that he has to face, it's kind of stark.
Yeah, because he's sympathetic to their plight, and but meanwhile they've got one general after another completely on their own and disobeying the federal instructions, right?
And slaughtering people, and once that happens, all trust is gone, and they're back to ground zero.
Yeah, the Hayes versus Tilden race. Again, well, I was in history class that day, but I don't know. Maybe I wasn't paying that much attention. But it is really just amazing. I remember when President George W. Bush, 43, was elected, and they had that issue of the vote count in Florida. That looks like baby food compared to the scandals and the cheating and all the rest of that went into that election that Grant had to resolve, right? This was not easy to unwind or put back together.
No, I mean, there are all kinds of allegations on both sides that blacks were prevented from getting to the polls, that there was an effort to squash the vote, that Republicans had stacked the deck. There was all kinds of stuff in these 3 different states. And you're right, it was a conundrum, and it was bedlam on the House floor. In fact, there were times when people were yelling Tilden or blood standing on a desk on the House floor. Now, rewind, when I'm starting to finish this book, and we're coming to get it all together, and January 6th happens. And I'm covering January 6th, the Capitol riot, and that's actually how the book starts, because I just do a TikTok of that coverage that day, thinking in my mind of the historical moment that I'm writing about in 1876, and how there's not similarities, but it gives you a perspective about where we've been before as a country, and how close we have been before as a country to tipping back to civil war, and what is needed to get out of that mess.
Yeah, I don't know if that election and this whole mess you're talking about was the genesis of the term smoke-filled room.
Right.
But it really was a smoke-filled room decision, right?
It was. The Wormley Hotel. And this shadowy figure, Edward Burke, who is a Louisiana guy who is working for Nichols, who is a challenger to the current Louisiana governor. He's a Democrat, this guy, Edward Burke. And he gets in touch with Grant and says, I think we can make a deal. It's always those Louisianans. They figure out a way to make a deal here. New Orleans style. But he starts talking about, you give the governorships in these states that are they're contested currently to the Democrats. You promise to pull all federal troops out of the South. The South promises to honor black rights and suffrage and equality, and they get the autonomy back and they stay in the Union. Now, Grant makes this deal and this bargain thinking that I think he thinks it's going to come together. If Ronald Reagan was there in 1876, he would probably say, my friend Ulysses, trust but verify. And it turns out, over the years, much like bringing in another book, Stalin did with FDR, promising that he was going to not invade Poland, the promise falls apart. And that leads to years of strife that obviously bring in Jim Crow laws and all of the civil rights strife that we saw in the years after that. Grant, I think, hoped that, one, they would keep the promise, and two, that the presidents that followed would then take that torch from him, the Lincoln legacy, and move it down the presidential road.
Yeah. So meanwhile, now we fast forward, and I think there's a moment in the book where you talk about maybe it was a town out west where a big, beautiful statue of Grant.
San Francisco.
San Francisco.
So the book is, at the end of the book is kind of just a perspective, because after George Floyd, the killing and the protest that resulted from that around the country, I was writing and I saw the coverage in San Francisco, and there's a Grant statue being pulled down, and a reporter is there live, and she turns around and says, why are you pulling the statue down? And the people doing it say, because he's part of the Civil War and he had a slave, and we got to move on from that. And it really struck me in that moment, because here's a guy who, yes, did have a slave. His father-in-law, Colonel Dent, gives him a slave, but he frees that man soon thereafter and spends the rest of his life fighting slavery, fighting for equality for blacks, fighting for the right to vote, and doing everything he can in his power to help the African-American communities get on their feet. In Grant's time, there are black congressmen, there are black senators, there are blacks who own farms and are making money in the South. Southern blacks are succeeding in those early years in Grant's presidency. And it just struck me in that moment, as that statue is toppling down, how little we remember about history and how sad that is, and how much we could do to make sure younger people remember history so that they can affect the future in a different way.
Yeah. Should pay attention in history class, right? So even with this kind of oblique definition and that the average person's mind about Grant, he's a drunk and all the rest of that, I get the sense, Bret, that at the end of the day, you would define Grant as an American hero.
100%. And I think history will look a lot brighter on Grant in years to come, and I hope I'm part of that, because everything that we found in treasure troves of the National Archives suggest that not only was he a military strategist and almost a savant when it came to strategy in the Civil War, but he was just a leader of men who was humble, patient, but had this cold resolve to get things done. And I think that Hamilton song, Who Writes Your History? It Matters. I think for years, because of the vestiges of Reconstruction and all that happened after that, all of the negativity got dumped on Grant. And maybe the drunk thing stuck, and the corruption was what led the review of his presidency. And I just think it deserves a full view.
Yeah. If you don't mind, Bret, there's a number of questions
Sure.
submitted by people in the audience. Now,
Happy
of course,
to.
these questions are not nearly as good as mine, but so it's the lightning round.
Okay, lightning
round. Who does your research for the books?
So the first researcher I hired for the history books was a woman named Sidney Soderberg, who is a former mayor of Salina, Kansas, which is the town next to Abilene. And she worked at the Eisenhower Library. And I first met her when I was kind of exploring Eisenhower and trying to figure out what I was going to write about Eisenhower. And the library said, "This is your best person." So we met and we talked, and she said to me, "Listen, I just want you to know something. I watch your show." And I said, "That's great." She said, "I like your show." I said, "That's better." And she said, "But I am a true blue Kansas Democrat." And I said, "Well, that's great. I'm a news anchor who likes history. So we are going to get along," and we did. And so with Sidney and Catherine Whitney, my co-author, we formed this team where we kind of just bounce these nuggets around until we get a blueprint. And then we are stitching pieces of a quilt together until we get the book that we get. And it takes a while. I write at night, usually with a glass of wine, and I'm a night owl. Fortunately, my wife, Amy, holds down the fort and allows me to do that.
Yeah. Let's see. Talk about Grant's relationship with Robert E. Lee, how well they knew each other, and was there a mutual respect?
So they obviously fought together in the Mexican-American War. There was a mutual respect. They communicated during the war by telegram. And he had Appomattox was a moment. And Lee, by the way, met all the picturesque thoughts of the perfect general. He was dressed to the nines, the sword, he was just perfectly immaculate, he was well-shaven, he just looked the part. And Grant did not at all, to the point where when he's winning battles, some of the early photographers cut off his head of the picture and put it on a different general who's sitting upright and looks better. It was like the first Photoshop of the Civil War. But they did have a relationship, and it continued after the war, and he invited Lee to the White House, which was quite a moment. And if I was in the press corps, that would have been a good thing to cover.
But they only spent something like 15 minutes together.
They did, yeah. But they kept in touch, and there was a mutual respect. There was a lot of debate about who was the better general strategically, and Lincoln was convinced it was Grant.
Describe your writing process beyond the glass of wine. I guess do you aim for a certain number of words or pages per day? How do you do that?
So I usually put in 2 hours, and I put myself in a room for 2 hours, and then we bounce back and forth. Catherine is just amazing at being able to stitch things together, and we ping pong, and it's a great team. Sidney is kind of the digger of the nuggets, and then we go from there.
What was your most interesting nugget that you found in writing this book about Grant?
So I do think that the Grant getting invited to Ford Theater is a really interesting nugget. I think that Grant's time as he is at the end of his life, trying to write that memoir and getting through that moment is also a really interesting nugget. But his relationships, I think, come forward in this book a lot more than other places where I've read about Grant. I think we get a little bit more context, a little bit more personality to his character. And that's in part from other writings of other people who described him.
Mm-hmm. There was about a paragraph in your book, Bret, about when you talked about the Ford's Theater and by chance how they almost came together. Maybe you could touch on it. It's either a rumor or a fact, or that John Wilkes Booth appears in front of Grant's carriage. Tell about this. Yeah.
So it's that night as they're going to get to New Jersey. John Wilkes Booth is seen riding horseback, and Grant then remembers and writes about this strange man staring him through the carriage in an ominous way that night. And it is believed that that is John Wilkes Booth chasing down the carriage as he's going out of town to New Jersey, turns around and goes to Ford Theater.
Yeah, amazing. There was a conspiracy, I recall, around Booth and other players and actors, and I presume maybe that was just part of the whole evening.
Yeah, and I mean, Grant's convinced it was him, but who knows? It could have been somebody else, but it was an ominous figure staring at his carriage as he's leaving Washington.
Are you planning another 3 days book?
3 days is 3 days. It is 3 books, so I think that is a good. By the way, it makes a great Christmas set. Fantastic for under the tree. No, I am going to do another To Rescue book, and we'll see what we're rescuing next. We'll give that in the business a deep tease. But it's in the process, it's in the works. Sydney has been deployed, and the nuggets are being mined currently.
I'm going to compress 2 questions into one because they seem to fit. What can we learn from 1876 that would help with conflict today, and how do you restore civic discourse to the present day?
I agree with you. Oh boy, whoever said "oh boy," I tell you what, that's really one of the big challenges of today, and we are a divided nation, clearly, but I think history can help give us a perspective of where we've been before, and we're a long way from where we were. Discourse takes leadership. Social media doesn't help, drives everybody apart. I don't know if you've visited my Twitter feed lately. It can be a very dark place occasionally. But I think that it just takes leaders. And we could use a Grant or an Eisenhower or a Reagan, frankly, optimistic leaders.
Boy, now we're coming forward. We're right in the thick of current events. What's your opinion of your competition at the other cable networks?
Oh, wow. And this is being recorded? Or?
No, not at all. It's off the record.
Oh, totally off the record. I have a lot of respect for my competition at other networks. However, I will say that I do think that some people who were regular news people they were somehow affected by Donald Trump and his administration to the point where emotion factored in more than it should have in some of the reporting, to where they lost some people in the trust factor. And it hurt all of us as journalists to do that. So when I took over for Brit Hume in January of 2009, he said two things to me. One, the show is not about you. And two, it's about the news. Let the news drive the show. So I look at it with these horse blinders of how I can make that hour be as newsy as possible, and somebody gets to the end of the hour and they feel like they know what's happening in the US, around the world, and they have some sense of analysis of the big moments from people who've covered Washington for decades. But I'm trying to take the emotion out of it from me. Of course, I have thoughts about things. I'm not a robot. But I want to be able to present it to you so you can make the decision. That whole thing, we report, you decide, is not just a slogan. I mean, I'm really trying to do that every night from 6 to 7, 3 to 4 your time.
Yeah. Any predictions for the 2022 elections?
Again, the camera is rolling. No, it's if you talk to Republicans on the Hill, they feel really excited about the prospects. They feel like they're in a good position. They feel like subject-wise, topic-wise, they have a number of things that they can talk about that they feel good about. So it should be, for the House side, according to Kevin McCarthy, paint by numbers. You know, they should pick up, they only need a few seats, and he's looking at 20, 30, 40, you know, big pickups of seats in the House. The Senate's much more difficult in that the battlegrounds are a little tougher for Republicans, and I think that'll come down to the candidates chosen. The biggest political thing, the elephant in the room, literally the elephant in the room, is the decision of the former president, whether he runs for president or not. And that will decide a lot about how different parties deal with that. If he does run, he will, of course, get a ton of attention, and every other candidate will be asked whatever the former president is saying or doing. I assume he'll be back on Twitter, which then will pick up our knowledge of what's happening inside President Trump's head. And that will be there will be a reaction to that. So it's very cyclical, and I think it's the biggest political thing that we will see in the next probably 6 to 10 months.
Yeah. Fair and balanced. What?
I haven't totally decided yet. I know you're going to ask, John. I haven't decided. It's a huge decision. I don't get to do that on the show that much.
What processes are in place to make real the slogan of fair and balanced? And do you have control or influence over the content in the balance?
Yes, I'm the executive editor of the show. So I am the buck stops with me. But I have a great team, and I have an executive producer, I have some writers, I've got a couple of producers, and we have a great team that has formed a really good system about trying to be an ice hockey goalie of news to prevent the bad pucks from getting through, and there are many bad pucks out there. So it is me, and I make the decisions. There's a morning meeting. It's collaborative. We all talk about things, but I'm the executive editor.
Serious question here. How did you like being on Gutfeld?
Let's see. Like a steak in the lion's den? No, I don't know. It was fun, but I didn't know what was happening. And once he started talking about Hunter Biden and whatever else, he had some skit about Pelosi, and I said I should probably exit stage left. I think I have an interview request for Speaker Pelosi. I hope she's not watching. And then he turned to me and said, she's not up this late. That I'm sure helped with the interview request as well.
Okay, our last two questions, and we're going to run out of time. I know I think you play ball. You love sports. Your kids play sports.
Yep.
What's your favorite golf course?
Favorite golf course? just because of the memories, it'd be Augusta National. But I love playing out here at Pebble Beach and the AT&T. There is nothing like that. And I talk to 3-4 million people a night through the camera. But when I'm standing in front of 200 people and I have to make a turn on a 3-wood, it's a different ballgame. And I played in college, and it's still a different ballgame. So.
Last question. Actually, this one's for me because I know, Bret, earlier in your career you had the Pentagon beat.
I did.
And so you are really well informed on the national security front. What is your opinion on what happened with the exit in Afghanistan? Was that the presidential decision? Was it a military foul-up? How do you see what occurred there?
From everything I've heard is that everyone was recommending troops remain until Americans are out, and that the president was very determined to have it the other way around so that zero be the end state quickly. And I think the recommendations, everything we can tell, are pretty much down the row. Even the State Department, I think, was weighing in on that front. So, I don't know if we know 100%, but I do think that this was a presidential decision. I think it's sad, having been there just a few weeks after 9/11. I landed at Bagram Air Base with Defense Secretary Rumsfeld. And, to see all that time, I embedded along the Afghan-Pakistan border with special ops. I was in these small Afghan villages where 20-year-old captains were essentially mayors of these little villages trying to get girls to go to school and set up the water system. And they did. And amazing things were happening. I just think we bit off a lot more than the original mission. But how we got out, not would we get out, but how we got out was sad. And I think former Defense Secretary Gates said it well on 60 Minutes. It was just sad. I'd be remiss if I didn't say, our condolences to the Powell family and the loss of Colin Powell this week. He was a great, great man, and he was larger than life when it came to Washington. But the stories that I have from researching Reagan as his national security advisor, and I'll just tell one very quickly, and that is they're in Moscow in the final summit, and they're finally coming to the end where they're going to make the final deal. And Gorbachev keeps on saying that there will be a peaceful coexistence, and we're going to add this line, this paragraph, that no interrupting in internal affairs, peaceful coexistence. And Reagan sees that he says it like 4 times, and he's suspicious of it. And he turns to Powell, and Powell scribbles on a corner of a paper, and he puts it down, and he slides it to Reagan. And Reagan looks at it, and then gets up and says, the answer is no, we're not adding that paragraph. And Gorbachev explodes and gets in Reagan's face. He's a little shorter. He's like in his face, and they're really yelling at each other, and the whole deal is about ready to fall apart. And then Gorbachev backs down and says, okay, and he's kind of defeated, and they don't add the paragraph. So everybody files out of the room, the deal is done, and Marlon Fitzwater goes back to the table and sees the little piece of paper and picks it up, and it says, if you agree, you can never criticize them again. Meaning you could never criticize the Soviet Union again if you put that paragraph in the deal. And Reagan saw that and trusted Powell so much that he risked the whole nuclear deal on that graph. And so Colin Powell's influence, not only with Reagan, but the Bushes and a lot of people in Washington, was exponential. And he was a good man.
Yeah, I know President Reagan stated publicly at one point that he had hoped that Powell would run for president someday and he'd vote for him. Mm-hmm. So really something. Bret, it has just been a very quick hour spent with you. Just wonderful. Thank you for coming, and thank you for such a terrific, terrific book. I'm so happy to have read it.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Great.